Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about a medieval Christian knight, someone from the really rugged, damp, and often freezing northern regions of the Iberian Peninsula.
Right, someone who has spent his entire life surrounded by very heavy, dark, thick-walled stone chapels, places with just narrow slits for windows.
Exactly. And now, picture that same knight traveling south, crossing the Guadalquivir River, and stepping through the gates of the Great Mosque of Córdoba.
It would be a complete visual shock.
It really would, because he doesn't see a standard roof resting on heavy stone walls. Instead, he walks into a forest. I mean, it is a seemingly endless, dizzying array of red and white striped arches that just stretch into the gloom.
Multiplying the space entirely.
Right. It creates this environment that feels weightless and infinite, smelling of citrus and incense. And that specific visual shock is exactly what we are looking at today. We are diving deep into the intricate, highly stylized world of Moorish architecture as part of our History of Architecture series.
And it is a massive topic.
It is. We are going to explore exactly how this distinct style developed in the Western Islamic world. We are covering a vast geographic footprint here, encompassing the Iberian Peninsula, which was historically known as Al-Andalus, and the Maghreb region of North Africa.
Right, and leaving a legacy that completely outlasted the empires that built it.
So for you listening, our mission today is to dissect precisely why these structures look the way they do. We want to know how they were engineered mechanically and really dig into the intense cultural intersections they represent.
Because it is a profound architectural tradition, mainly because it is defined by adaptation and, well, survival.
Right.
We are looking at a system of design that did not just invent itself in a vacuum. It actively integrated pre-Islamic Roman, Byzantine, and Visigothic influences, but mixed them with ongoing artistic currents from the Islamic Middle East.
So it is a true synthesis.
A complete synthesis that is entirely distinct. I mean, it is an architectural language that tells the story of exiles, conquerors, fragile alliances, and this very profound theological philosophy. And all of that is encoded directly into the stone, the brick, and the plaster.
Well, let's unpack this by going back to the absolute origins, because if we want to understand why a building like the Great Mosque of Córdoba looks the way it does, we have to look at the severe desperation of the person who ordered it built.
It really do. We need to start in the 8th century, specifically the year 750.
Okay.
We are dealing with a historical figure named Abd al-Rahman I. He eventually became known as the Emigre.
The Emigre, meaning he was an exile.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
His story is one of sheer survival following a very violent dynastic collapse.
He was on the run.
Very much so. He was fleeing from Damascus after a brutal coup d'etat. So his family, the Umayyad dynasty of Syria, had ruled the Islamic world since the year 661.
Right.
But in the year 750, they were violently overthrown and massacred, actually, by a new faction called the Abbasids. The Abbasids would eventually establish their power base in Baghdad, but Abd al-Rahman, who was a young Umayyad prince, somehow managed to survive the slaughter of his family.
So he just runs.
He runs. What followed was a massive, highly perilous journey across the entire breadth of North Africa. He was a hunted man.
Just constantly moving.
Constantly. Eventually, he takes refuge with his mother's people, who were Berber tribesmen.
So he crosses the entire Mediterranean coast, running from Abbasid assassins, and he eventually crosses the Strait of Gibraltar into Iberia.
Yes. And eventually, in the year 756, he arrives in Córdoba. And here, against all odds really, he manages to consolidate power and found a new Hispano-Umayyad line.
But look at his political reality at that moment.
It is complicated.
Very. I mean, he is a Syrian Arab Muslim in exile, suddenly ruling over a population in Iberia that is overwhelmingly Christian.
Right, and he is ruling alongside various Berber and Arab factions that are highly fractured themselves.
So he needs to project authority immediately. He needs a physical monument that essentially says, I am here, I am legitimate, and the Umayyad dynasty is not dead.
And that physical monument is the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Work is initiated around the year 785 or 786, and they chose a highly strategic, very symbolic location.
The site of an old Visigothic church.
Right.
Dedicated to St. Vincent.
Exactly. By building on this specific site, he is physically layering his new authority over the pre-existing religious and political center of the city.
Let's break down the physical reality of this early construction. Because when we talk about the mosque, people picture the massive complex it is today. What did this very first iteration actually look like?
The original building was actually a relatively straightforward square enclosure. It consisted of two main parts. You had an open courtyard, which is essential in Islamic architecture for ablutions and gathering.
Right.
And then you had a roofed prayer room. This initial prayer room featured 10 arcades that divided the space into 11 naves. And all of these naves ran perpendicular to the Qibla wall.
The Qibla wall being the wall that indicates the direction of Mecca, the direction you face for prayer.
Correct. And set into that Qibla wall was a simple mihrab, or prayer niche. Now, the architectural challenge they faced in building this roofed space is really where the ingenuity of the Moorish style begins.
Because they didn't just go out and quarry brand new, perfectly uniform stone for this massive building. The sources point out that they relied heavily on architectural spolia.
You did.
They were actively scavenging materials. Specifically, they were taking columns and capitals from existing Roman and Visigothic structures that were just scattered around the region.
They gathered hundreds of columns from ruined Roman temples, old administrative buildings, older churches.
But wait, if you take a column from a Roman temple and then another column from a Visigothic church, they are absolutely not going to be the same height.
No, not at all.
They won't have the same diameter or even the same structural integrity. So it is basically like trying to build a perfectly level dining room table using legs stolen from 4 entirely different pieces of furniture.
It is a massive engineering problem.
Right. How do you support a heavy, uniform, flat roof on a complete forest of mismatched columns?
That is the defining structural problem of that early mosque. Because if you just lay a heavy timber roof on those uneven columns, the structure will eventually collapse under its own irregular weight distribution.
Right, it would just buckle.
Exactly.
Oh.
So to achieve the necessary height for the room, because some of these salvaged columns were actually quite short, and to stabilize this chaotic collection of spolia, the early Moorish architects implemented a really brilliant structural workaround. They created the double arcade.
Explain how that actually works mechanically. Because it looks beautiful, but it is doing a lot of work.
It is doing a ton of work. They used a system of superimposed arches. So imagine the salvaged Roman column standing there. On top of that column, they place a structural element called a pilaster.
Okay.
From that central point on the pilaster, they spring 2 arches. The lower arch, which is often a horseshoe shape, acts like a brace.
A horizontal brace.
Right. It connects the columns horizontally, providing lateral stability. It essentially keeps the columns from splaying outward under pressure.
That makes sense.
Then, springing from higher up on that same pilaster, they build a second, upper arch. This upper arch is a traditional semicircular shape, and it is this upper arch that actually carries the vertical downward weight of the timber roof above.
So the lower arch ties the whole room together horizontally, while the upper arch handles the downward crushing force of the ceiling.
Precisely. And visually, they constructed the voussoirs, which are the wedge-shaped blocks that make up the curve of the arch itself, using alternating materials.
Right.
They switched back and forth between white stone and red brick.
Which creates that incredibly famous red and white striped effect that we all associate with Córdoba today. But I have to ask, is that just for looks, or is there a mechanical reason for alternating brick and stone?
It actually serves a vital structural purpose. You have to remember that southern Iberia is a seismically active region.
Oh, earthquakes.
Lots of earthquakes. Now, a solid stone arch is incredibly strong under compression, but it is rigid. If the ground shakes, rigid stone can crack and fail.
Because it can't bend.
Right. Red brick, however, has a slightly different elasticity. So by alternating a few bricks, then a block of white stone, then more bricks, they introduced a degree of flexibility into the arches.
So the brick acts almost like a subtle shock absorber.
That is exactly it. It allowed for weight distribution and flexibility, and that is a huge part of why the building has survived for over a millennium. But as you pointed out, it also became a defining visual hallmark. It creates this rhythmic pattern that just draws the eye endlessly through the space.
Now, this initial construction under Abd al-Rahman I took years. It was finally completed by his successor, Hisham I. But looking at the timeline in the sources, the mosque didn't stay a simple square enclosure for long.
No, it evolved constantly.
There is just a relentless sequence of expansions by subsequent rulers. It honestly seems like every time a new leader took power and accumulated enough wealth, their immediate impulse was to knock down a wall and make the mosque bigger.
The continuous expansion of the site is essentially a physical record of the dynasty's growing wealth, their population, and their political ambition.
Give me an example of that timeline.
Well, for example, during the reign of Abd al-Rahman II in the 9th century, the population of Córdoba was exploding. The original prayer room was just no longer sufficient. So he enlarged the space to the south. He physically moved the Qibla wall 26 meters further south.
And there is a notable shift in the materials at this point, right? I mean, they aren't just relying on scavenged Roman parts anymore.
That is a critical transition. By the time of Abd al-Rahman II, the local economy and the artisanal guilds had developed to a point where they were producing their own materials.
They didn't need to scavenge.
Right. For the first time, we see specially produced capitals being carved specifically for the mosque, and they are integrated right alongside the older, salvaged ones. The state is wealthy enough to commission entirely new stonework.
Then we move to Muhammad I.
Under Muhammad I, the focus shifts slightly to the refinement of the space. He finished the Maqsura.
And the Moorish is a highly important architectural feature.
Very important. It is a protected, enclosed sanctuary space near the mihrab, and it is reserved exclusively for the imam or the ruling caliph.
So it is a physical manifestation of the ruler's elevated status.
Yes, and a very practical security measure. He also restored the St. Stephen's Gate. Following him, his sons Al-Mundir and Abdallah added administrative and functional elements. They built a treasure room and a covered passageway known as a sabbat.
And a sabbat allowed the ruler to enter the mosque directly from his palace, right, without having to walk through the public streets.
Exactly. It was a private, elevated corridor. But the scale of ambition really takes a massive leap in the 10th century with Abd al-Rahman III.
Because Abd al-Rahman III changes the political reality of Al-Andalus forever. In the 10th century, he makes the unprecedented decision to declare himself the true caliph of the Islamic world.
Yes, so he's not just an emir or a local ruler anymore. He is claiming supreme religious and political authority over the entire Muslim world.
He's directly challenging the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in North Africa.
And that kind of massive political claim requires massive architectural proof. He elevates the status of Córdoba to an imperial capital. And to reflect this, he reconstructs the entire entrance wall to the prayer room.
To make it grander.
Much grander. He vastly expands the courtyard to accommodate the surging population, and he builds a massive new minaret.
A minaret is the tower from which the call to prayer is issued.
Right, but under Abd al-Rahman III, it also functions as a towering visual symbol of his new caliphal authority. It was visible from everywhere in the city, and actually, if you visit Córdoba today, the lower portion of that exact minaret is still preserved. It is encased right inside the later Christian bell tower.
Which brings us to his successor, Al-Hakam II. When you look at the visual history of the mosque, his expansion seems to be the one that really defines the absolute peak of this specific stylistic refinement.
Yes, under Al-Hakam II, the architectural language moves beyond mere structural necessity. It enters a phase of pure aesthetic poetry. He extends the arcades southwards once again.
They keep pushing south.
They do. But he terminates this specific expansion in a highly monumental new Maqsura, and he erects a completely new Qibla wall with a breathtaking new mihrab.
What makes this particular mihrab so different from the previous ones?
It is the intense application of surface decoration. This is where we see the introduction of extremely rich mosaics. In fact, the historical record indicates he actually requested master mosaicists from the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople to help execute these specific designs.
That is a striking detail, a diplomatic request for artists.
Exactly. The mihrab is framed by intricate pieces of sculpted marble and these really complex intertwined arches. The architectural supports themselves become delicately sculpted.
So they are no longer just holding up the roof.
No, they are carved and manipulated specifically to delight the eye. He also crowned this new space with 5 cupolas. These are ribbed domes adorned with rich, glittering mosaics that just catch the light in a space that is otherwise quite dark.
Okay, so they expand south under Abd al-Rahman II. They expand south again under Al-Hakam II. They keep pushing the building toward the river, but eventually they just run out of land.
Exactly. The final major expansion occurs in the late 10th century under the governance of Al-Mansur. He was the de facto ruler during the time of the Caliph Hisham II.
Right.
The population still needed more space, but they could no longer enlarge the mosque to the south because the Guadalquivir River was literally right in the way.
The physical geography finally forced their hand.
It did. So the decision was made to expand laterally to the east.
And that is a massive undertaking.
Huge. They added 8 entire new naves to the eastern side of the building. They maintained the exact existing elevation of the room, and they expanded the courtyard proportionally. But this massive lateral expansion created a really distinct architectural quirk.
What kind of quirk?
Well, because they expanded to the side, the highly decorated mihrab and that monumental masura built by Al-Hakam II were suddenly no longer at the exact geometric center of the Qibla wall.
Oh, I see.
The symmetry of the entire building was fundamentally altered just by the sheer necessity of needing more floor space.
So Córdoba essentially serves as this perfect frozen timeline. You can walk through it and see the structural necessities and the physical expansions of the dynasty century by century.
Layer by layer.
But let's shift gears slightly, because as much as they were dealing with engineering problems like mismatched columns and the proximity of a river, they were also operating under incredibly strict philosophical and religious rules. Rules that dictated exactly how these spaces could be ornamented. Because they weren't just building walls, they were building a theological worldview out of stone and plaster.
All Islamic art and design, which naturally encompasses the Moorish style, operates under a tradition that emphasizes a very profound connection to the divine. However, this connection is governed by very specific prohibitions.
Right.
And the most prominent and influential of these is the concept of aniconism.
Meaning the absolute prohibition of pictorial representations of people, animals, or God.
Yes. In traditional Islamic or Moorish architectural ornamentation, particularly in religious spaces, you will not see human characteristics represented at all.
Why is that rule so absolute?
The theological reasoning is that God is unique, without form, and beyond human comprehension. So to attempt to depict God is impossible, and it borders on idolatry.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, depicting human or animal forms was often seen as an attempt to mimic the creative act of God, which was strictly forbidden.
So if I am a master artisan working on the new expansion in Córdoba, and my patron tells me to make the walls beautiful, but I am legally and religiously barred from painting a portrait or carving a statue or depicting a historical scene, what do I actually do?
You are forced to innovate. Because human forms were off the table, the artisans channeled their immense skill into entirely different, highly complex decorative techniques. They essentially elevated mathematics, language, and nature to the status of divine representation.
Okay.
They relied on three main pillars of ornamentation: calligraphy, complex geometric patterns, and vegetative design.
Let's break those down. Calligraphy is architecture.
Calligraphy is ubiquitous in this style. It is not just writing on a wall like a plaque. The writing itself becomes the structural art.
How so?
Artisans would intricately carve Quranic verses, poetry, or praises to the ruler directly into the plaster, the wood, or the stone. The Arabic script, particularly the angular Kufic script or the more flowing cursive scripts, was stylized to interact directly with the architecture.
Like wrapping around doorways?
Exactly. Framing arches, wrapping around domes, outlining windows. The word of God physically envelops the space.
And then you have the geometric patterns. Circles, squares, these very complex, interlocking, multi-pointed stars. When I look at those massive tiled walls, it seems like there is a very specific intentional meaning behind those geometric choices. It isn't just because it looks mathematically orderly.
No, it is deeply philosophical. The intention behind these geometric patterns is to evoke the concept of the infinite.
The infinite.
Yes. When you look at a Moorish geometric panel, it doesn't have a clear focal point. It just repeats endlessly.
Right, there is no center portrait to look at.
Exactly. By repeating geometric motifs mathematically without a clear beginning or a clear end, the observer's eye is constantly moving. You are visually reminded of the infinite, boundless nature of the divine.
That is a profound way to design a room.
It is a visual meditation on God's unending presence. It is a way of representing the divine order of the universe, but without depicting God's face.
What about the vegetative designs? You see these interwoven vines, tendrils, and floral patterns everywhere in these buildings.
The vegetative motifs, known as arabesques, serve a similar symbolic purpose. They consist of rhythmic, undulating, intertwining vines and leaves. And along with the actual physical environment of the buildings, the lush courtyard gardens filled with fruit-bearing trees, fountains, and reflecting pools.
Right.
These floral motifs symbolize heavenly flowers. They represent the beauty of the natural world, and they are a direct physical reference to the descriptions of paradise found in the Quran.
I've also noticed a lot of sunburst shapes.
Yes, you frequently see sunburst medallions used in the vaulting and on doors. These were used to symbolize the vault of heaven itself.
This brings up a major characteristic of Moorish architecture that is just fascinating to consider. The sources point to a distinct inside-out approach to design.
Yeah.
When you look at the exterior of these buildings, there's a profound structural conservatism. The outsides are highly plain, very unadorned, heavy, and almost severe in some cases. But the moment you transition into the interior, it is rich, ethereal, and bursting with these infinite geometries and colors. Walk me through the psychological or cultural effect of that specific transition. What actually happens when someone walks from a dusty, chaotic medieval street into one of these vibrant courtyards?
It creates an immediate, very profound psychological boundary. The plain, heavy exterior essentially acts as a fortress. And I mean that not just in a military sense, but spiritually.
Okay.
It separates the mundane, noisy, chaotic, and secular world of the street from the ordered, paradisical world of the interior.
So it's an architectural airlock.
That is a perfect way to describe it. When you step through that threshold, the sensory shift is absolute.
You leave the dust behind.
Right, you get this sudden explosion of azulejo tiles.
Those are the ceramic tiles.
Yes, these vibrant, glazed ceramic tiles in deep blues, greens, bright whites, and earth tones. And that is combined with the intricate, lace-like stucco panels covering the upper walls. It creates an atmosphere of immediate revelation.
The architecture is actively forcing a shift in your state of mind.
Exactly. The transition tells you that you have left the harsh reality of the outside world, and you have entered a space explicitly designed for reflection, safety, and proximity to the divine.
But this approach to ornamentation wasn't entirely static, right? The style evolved. We see a major shift occur during the Almohad period.
We do.
The Almohads were a Berber Muslim movement that eventually unified the Maghreb in North Africa and Al-Andalus in Iberia between the 11th and 13th centuries.
And the Almohad aesthetic represents a significant, highly intentional evolution in the style. If you compare them to the earlier Caliphal period of Córdoba or the fragmented Taifa kingdoms that followed it, the Almohads were much more restrained in their ornamentation.
Why the restraint? Did they just lose the technical skill to carve the stucco?
Not at all. It was a philosophical choice rooted in their specific religious reform movement.
Okay.
The Almohads preached a return to stricter, simpler Islamic principles. They actually viewed the exhaustive, minute surface decoration of the earlier eras as decadent, so they pulled back.
Interesting.
Instead of covering every square inch of a wall in intricate stucco, they focused their attention on overall architectural proportions.
They relied on the actual empty spaces to do the decorative work.
Yes, the interplay of light and shadow across deeply carved surfaces became the primary focus. They strove for a deliberate balance between decorated surfaces and plain, unadorned areas. The motifs from earlier periods, like the arches and the floral patterns, were refined. They were stripped down to their essential geometry and given a much grander, monumental scale.
And looking at the construction records, this shift in their visual aesthetic also aligned perfectly with a major shift in how they actually built things.
Yes. During the Almohad period, construction became a massive state-sponsored industry on a scale unseen in the region since the days of the Roman Empire.
They were building everywhere.
Everywhere. They needed to build fortresses, mosques, and administrative centers across a vast, newly unified territory. So, to do this rapidly, they heavily utilized rammed earth, which is known as tapial and brick.
Now, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, what exactly is rammed earth? How do you build a palace out of dirt?
It is essentially medieval concrete. You take earth, gravel, sand, and a mining agent like lime, and you pack it tightly into massive wooden molds. You compress it layer by layer until it cures into a solid, rock-hard wall.
So it's very utilitarian.
Highly utilitarian. These materials were relatively cheap, incredibly durable, and readily available at almost any building site.
Which allowed them to scale up.
Exactly. This allowed the Almohads to execute numerous, highly ambitious construction projects rapidly across their empire. And the stark, massive, geometric aesthetic of those rammed earth walls perfectly suited their restrained, proportional approach to design.
That mastery of light, shadow, and monumental proportion under the Almohads links perfectly to the specific structural shapes that define the Moorish style overall. We have to talk about the evolution of the art.
They do.
Because they moved far beyond the standard heavy Roman semicircular arch. They basically turned the arch into an art form.
The diverse typology of arches is arguably the most recognizable identifier of Moorish architecture. They continuously experimented with the geometry of the arch to alter how a space felt and how loads were distributed.
Let's start with the most famous one, the horseshoe arch, or the keyhole arch.
Yeah.
Now, looking at the architectural history and the sources, I want to clarify something because it's a very common misconception. The Muslims didn't actually invent the horseshoe arch, did they?
That is correct, they did not. The keyhole, or horseshoe arch, actually originated much earlier in pre-Islamic Syria.
Okay.
It was subsequently adopted and used by the Visigoths, the Germanic people who inhabited the Iberian Peninsula before the Islamic arrival in 711. You can actually see primitive versions of it in early Visigothic churches.
So if they didn't invent it, what did the Umayyads actually do to make it the signature Moorish element?
They adopted it, but they heavily stylized it. They accentuated its curvature, pinching it further inward at the bottom. And crucially, they added the alternating colored voussoirs we discussed earlier.
The red and white stripes.
Right. They took an existing, somewhat clunky structural form and refined it into an elegant signature element.
And the visual impact of that pinched shape is striking. The maximum width of a horseshoe arch is actually higher up, meaning the arch is wider than the space between the supporting columns.
Yes.
Observers in the sources often describe it as evoking a billowing sail propelled by the wind.
That greater width at the top creates a very specific spatial dynamic. It makes the interior feel porous and open. The widening allows more light and air to move freely through the space, enhancing the sensory experience of the room.
So it feels less oppressive.
Exactly. A heavy Roman barrel vault pushes down on you. A Moorish horseshoe arch feels lighter, as if the architecture is expanding upward and outward.
And they certainly didn't stop at the horseshoe. The experimentation just kept going, getting more and more complex.
They developed a rich, highly complex vocabulary of arch forms. You have the multifoil arch. Instead of a single smooth curve, the inner surface of the arch is made up of multiple overlapping smaller circles resembling symmetrical leaf shapes.
But how does a multifoil arch actually bear weight? Because to look at it, it looks like someone took a bite out of the support structure.
The genius is that the overarching geometry still channels the compressive forces downward into the columns, but the inner edge is carved away into these lobes purely for aesthetic delight.
That is a clever workaround.
It is. Then you have the lancet arch, which is steeply pointed and very narrow. They often group these in clusters of 3 or 5 to draw the eye upward and let in slivers of light. You have the ogee arch, which is highly complex. It uses 2 S-curves that curve outward and then swoop back inward to meet at a sharp apex at the top. And finally, there is the lambrequin arch, which abandons a smooth profile entirely and incorporates highly ornate stalactite-like sculpting right into the structural profile of the arch itself.
Looking at all these variations, the multifoil, the ogee, the lambrequin, it seems driven heavily by visual experimentation. Like they are playing with the masonry to see just how delicate, how complex, and frankly, how logic-defying they can make heavy stone look.
You are hitting on the core brilliance of the style right there. The engineering becomes the aesthetic. The Moorish architects mastered the load-bearing requirements of masonry to such a degree that they could afford to literally carve away at the mass.
They had math on their side.
Exactly. They created incredibly intricate profiles that served to delight the eye while still holding up a massive roof. And this principle, making heavy stone appear weightless, reaches its absolute zenith with a feature called muqarnas,
The honeycomb vaulting.
also known as stalactite vaulting. It is one of the most stunning innovations in Islamic architecture.
Walk me through exactly how muqarnas works mechanically. Because when you look up at one of these ceilings, it looks like a fractal. It looks like 1,000 individual pieces of a puzzle just hanging in midair.
To understand muqarnas, you have to understand corbelling. So imagine a square room, and you want to put a circular dome on top of it. You have to bridge the 90-degree corners. Architecturally, you use a squinch or a corbel. That is basically stacking bricks diagonally across the corner, stepping them further inward layer by layer until the square becomes an octagon and then a circle.
So you are stepping the masonry out into the empty space.
Exactly. What muqarnas does is take that simple stepping process and divide it geometrically into hundreds of tiny downward-facing cupolas or cells.
Okay.
These individual geometric cells are clustered together in staggered layers, projecting out over the empty space below. It creates a complex, three-dimensional geometric surface that looks exactly like a honeycomb, or a natural stalactite formation hanging from the ceiling.
And the visual effect is totally disorienting, but in the best way possible.
It creates profound ethereal depth. Especially within domes, half domes over entrances, or deep niches, it completely obscures the heavy, load-bearing masonry behind it.
Because it catches the light.
Yes, by catching the light in hundreds of different tiny alcoves, it makes a solid stone or plaster ceiling look like a floating, weightless tapestry of light and shadow. The ceiling essentially appears to dissolve.
Okay, we've talked about the infinite geometry, the structural workarounds, the muqarnas, and the complex arches. I want to look at an environment where all of these elements culminate in a single unified site. Let's move ahead in time and head to the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains to talk about the Alhambra.
The Alhambra is the crown jewel of the Nasrid dynasty, which was the last Islamic kingdom in Iberia. It is situated on a steep, highly defensible hill overlooking the city of Granada, and it occupies a massive site, measuring 720 meters long by 220 meters wide.
And the name itself, Alhambra, tells you exactly what you're looking at from the outside.
The name translates roughly to the red one. It derives from the red clay taken from that very hill, which was mixed into the rammed earth used to construct its imposing, heavily fortified outer walls.
It is the ultimate expression of that dual nature we discussed earlier. From the outside, it is a heavy, red-walled, intimidating fortress meant to withstand a siege. But the moment you pass through the gates, it is a highly refined, delicate royal residence.
We can focus specifically on the Palacio de los Leones, the Palace of the Lions, to really understand the refinement. This section was built primarily by Sultan Muhammad V.
Okay.
He had two reigns, ruling first from 1354 to 1359, and then, after a brief period of exile, he returned to power and ruled from 1362 until 1391. He was deeply invested in the architecture. He acted as both the primary promoter and essentially the chief architect of this specific space.
The Patio de los Leones is the centerpiece of his vision. You walk into this courtyard, and you are surrounded by a perimeter gallery supported by incredibly slender marble columns. And there are these pavilions projecting into the courtyard that are considered absolute masterpieces of Nasrid art.
The integration of elements in the Patio de los Leones represents the absolute peak of the Moorish architectural program. You have the water channels representing the four rivers of paradise flowing perfectly into a central fountain, supported by 12 stone lions.
Right.
You have the dappled sunlight playing over exhaustively carved stucco walls. But directly adjacent to this serene patio is a room that presents a fascinating historical puzzle: the Sala de los Reyes, the Hall of the Kings, or the Hall of Justice.
And here's where I have to push back on everything we established earlier.
Oh, about the rules.
Yes, we spent a long time discussing aniconism, the strict absolute ban on depicting human forms. Yet if you walk into the Sala de los Reyes and look up into the vaults, there are 3 unique medieval paintings done on leather skin, and they prominently depict human figures.
They do.
They show court life, power scenes, knights, actual representations of people. How does this possibly fit into a tradition defined by strict Islamic design rules?
Are they just breaking their own laws?
It is a brilliant contradiction, and it raises an important point about the reality of lived history versus strict theological doctrine. Architecture and art are rarely perfectly obedient to textbooks. The presence of these paintings suggests a few critical realities about the Nasrid kingdom at that time.
What does it tell us about the court of Muhammad V?
It tells us that by the late 14th century, the Nasrid court in Granada was highly cosmopolitan. They were not isolated. They were interacting, trading, and engaging in diplomacy heavily with Christian European kingdoms to the north, where portraiture and figurative painting were completely common.
So there was a porous cultural exchange happening. They were absorbing influences from their Christian neighbors. Yes. Second, it shows that within the highly private, secluded spaces of the royal palace, spaces not meant for public prayer or the general population, the strict rules of aniconism could occasionally be relaxed or modified to serve the political and dynastic needs of the sultan.
So it's about projecting power.
Exactly. These paintings are an assertion of royal power, lineage, and courtly chivalry. They suggest that the ruler's desire to project the majesty of his court momentarily superseded the traditional geometric and calligraphic norms. The Sultan was powerful enough to essentially bend the rules in his own private chambers.
It shows they were making dynamic, pragmatic choices based on their political reality. But let's look at the physical reality of the Sala de los Reyes, because it highlights another major theme of this architecture, which is extreme fragility. We talked about how heavy stone was made to look weightless, but in the Alhambra, a lot of this decoration wasn't heavy stone at all.
Despite the incredible visual weight and complexity of the muqarnas domes in the Sala de los Reyes, They were built from highly fragile materials. The Nasrids relied heavily on carved plaster and stucco for their intricate detailing.
Because it was easier to carve.
It was fast to carve, but inherently delicate. The southern muqarnas dome in this room is a prime example of both the dizzying complexity and the terrifying vulnerability of the style.
When we look at the structural blueprints of that single dome, how many individual pieces are we talking about?
That single southern dome contains nearly 2,000 individual plaster pieces, all suspended in midair, relying on a delicate geometric balance to stay aloft.
2,000 pieces of plaster forming a honeycomb ceiling. And today, when researchers use 3D laser scanning on that room, they see significant deformations. The dome is sagging and warping in ways that are visible to the naked eye.
The history of that damage is a terrifying timeline of environmental and structural trauma. You have to remember, the region of Granada is highly seismic.
Let's trace that timeline in the sources because it places the architecture right in the middle of a war zone.
In 1431, the region was hit by two massive earthquakes. Modern geologists estimate magnitudes of approximately 6.5 and 6.8.
That is massive.
And the epicenter was in Aturfe, dangerously close to the Alhambra itself. These quakes were severe enough to cause sections of the Alhambra's heavy outer walls and towers to collapse.
Now consider the terror of that moment. You were standing under a ceiling made of 2,000 interlocking pieces of fragile plaster and a 6.8 magnitude earthquake hits. It is a miracle the entire muqarnas vault didn't just shatter into dust. And the timing of this earthquake is wild because of what is happening right outside the walls.
The timing is incredible. These twin earthquakes struck just days before the Christian king Juan II of Castile occupied the fertile plains surrounding Granada, which led directly to the Battle of Higueroa.
So you have massive seismic damage warping the structural integrity of the palace right as a major military conflict arrives on the doorstep.
Precisely. The environment and the political situation were collapsing simultaneously. And the trauma to the building didn't stop there. Between 1522 and 1531, a new series of severe earthquakes, again around magnitude 6.5, caused further structural damage, particularly to the Patio de los Leones.
But by 1522, the political situation in Iberia had changed entirely. The people fixing the Alhambra weren't the people who built it.
That is the critical turning point. By the time of the 1520s earthquakes, the Iberian Peninsula was no longer under Islamic rule.
Right.
The long Christian Reconquista had culminated in 1492 with the fall of Granada. The Islamic empires that built Córdoba and the Alhambra were gone from power.
But the architecture stayed, and the new rulers had to maintain it. We see repair records from the 1500s detailing this.
We have specific documentation from 1541 and 1542 detailing the urgent replacement of damaged plasterwork. They also had to place heavy physical braces just to stop the slender columns in the patio from buckling entirely. In 1555, formal specifications were drawn up detailing exactly how the plasters were to be repaired.
And those repair efforts point to the final, fascinating evolution we need to discuss today. The empires fell, but the architectural language survived. It evolved into what is known as the Mudéjar legacy.
Yes, Mudéjar art spans primarily from the 13th to the 16th centuries. To understand it, we have to look at the term itself. It derives from the Arabic word mudarjan, which translates roughly to domesticated or subject people.
It refers to the Muslims who remained in the territories conquered by the Christians.
Yes. As the Christian kingdoms pushed south, many Muslims remained in the former areas of Al-Andalus. They were temporarily allowed to practice their religion and maintain their customs to a limited degree. This was before the tragic forced conversions and mass exiles that took place between the late 15th and mid-16th centuries.
But during that window, while they were living under Christian rule, their architectural expertise was in incredibly high demand. The Christian kings realized that these subject people were the best builders on the peninsula.
The Islamic motifs, the unparalleled craftsmanship, the specific techniques, like the intricate geometric brickwork, the deeply carved wooden ceilings known as artesanato, and the highly prized Hispano-Moresque lusterware ceramics, they were all actively applied to Christian structures.
And this creates a massive historical paradox. Let's think about this logically. Why would victorious Christian kings, who had just spent centuries fighting bitter, bloody, ideologically driven wars to conquer these Islamic territories, turn around and choose to build their own palaces, their own churches, and their own victory monuments using the exact aesthetic style of the people they had just defeated.
It is one of the most fascinating cultural dynamics in architectural history. Looking at the history, there are two highly compelling, though distinct, theories that explain this phenomenon. The first is the theory of triumphalism.
Dominance through architecture,
Yeah,
using the enemy's style to prove you beat them.
exactly. According to this theory, appropriating the Moorish style was an active, aggressive statement of conquest. It allowed the Christian kings to visually consume and claim the highly refined, luxurious culture of Al-Andalus for themselves. By taking the architectural language of the defeated emirates and plastering it onto Christian monuments, they were turning Islamic aesthetics into permanent, visible emblems of Christian victory.
Okay, I see.
It was a way of projecting to the world, we do not just own your land, we own your high culture, and we can deploy your master craftsmen for our own glory.
It's a very Roman concept. You conquer Greece, and suddenly every Roman senator wants a Greek statue in his villa to prove he owns Greece. But the second theory suggests it was far less about grand religious statements of dominance and much more about localized, pragmatic, messy politics.
Yes, because the political alliances on the Iberian Peninsula during this era were incredibly blurred. The lines were rarely cleanly drawn between Muslim on one side and Christian on the other. A perfect example of this complexity is the alliance between Pedro of Castile-Leon, often known as Pedro the Cruel, who reigned from 1350 to 1369, and Muhammad V of Granada.
The same Muhammad V who built the Palace of the Lions in the Alhambra.
The very same. When Pedro faced brutal internal feuds and serious military challenges to his throne from his own half-brother, he did not turn to his Christian neighbors. He relied heavily on the political and military support of Muhammad V. They were allies, bound by mutual political survival.
So you have a Christian king being kept in power by the military support of a Muslim sultan.
And as a direct result of that deep, practical alliance, when Pedro commissioned the construction of his new royal residence, the Alcazar of Seville, he utilized a heavily Islamic style. Muhammad V actually sent his own master artisans from Granada to Seville to help build it.
That is profound.
The Alcazar of Seville is a Mudéjar masterpiece commissioned by a Christian king, built by Muslim craftsmen, heavily influenced and aided by his Muslim ally. We see a similar dynamic earlier with Alfonso XI. After a major military victory in 1340, he built the Hall of Justice in a striking Mudéjar style. The architecture reflects a shared cultural vocabulary among the Iberian elite. Regardless of their nominal religion, they all agreed on what a palace was supposed to look like.
And we see this fusion spreading all over the landscape, even into the religious structures themselves. Let's look at the San Tirso Church in Sahagun.
Built just before 1123, San Tirso is a prime early example of this architectural synthesis moving north. It is a brick church with a projecting eastern apse. Functionally, it is a Christian space. But that exterior facade is articulated with stacked rows of blind arches done in complex brickwork.
So you have a Christian patron utilizing an Islamic structural typology to build a Romanesque church. The architectural language completely transcends the religious boundary.
It proves that the techniques were valued for their beauty and efficiency, stripping them of their original theological context and adapting them to a new one.
Which brings us perfectly back to where we started our journey today, the Great Mosque of Córdoba. When the Christian forces finally conquered Córdoba, you would expect, given the violence of the era, that they would tear down the ultimate symbol of Umayyad power. But they didn't.
No, they didn't tear it down. The structure was simply too magnificent, too monumental, and frankly, too useful to destroy. Instead, it was consecrated as a Christian space. It became the Cathedral of Santa Maria. This consecration happened first in 1146, and then definitively, permanently, in 1236.
And remarkably, the daily Catholic Mass has been held there by the cathedral chapter without missing a single day since that consecration in 1236.
But they didn't just leave it as it was. Over the centuries, they physically cut into the center of the mosque. They built a towering Gothic and Renaissance cathedral nave right into the middle of the Umayyad double arcades. Today, it stands as a massive, breathtaking hybrid structure.
Right, you walk through the endless Islamic arches and suddenly find yourself standing beneath a soaring Renaissance dome.
It is a physical manifestation of centuries of contested history. It is a single building that holds the artistic and religious ambitions of entirely different civilizations, violently but inextricably locked together in stone. Architecture essentially serves as a stratigraphy of forgetting and remembering.
That makes a lot of sense.
We often assume that buildings are entirely loyal to the empires that lay their foundations, that they die when the empire dies. But the reality is they adapt, they are appropriated, and they endure. They become physical testaments to the complex, violent, and often contradictory blending of human cultures. When you look at a horseshoe arch in a European building today, or a star pattern on a wooden ceiling, you aren't just looking at clever brickwork. You are looking at a frozen moment of cultural assimilation and ultimate survival.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.